Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on how to win the war against mobile banking fraud. I'm grateful to the speakers for taking the time to join us and to share their insights with us, and OneSpan for sponsoring this webinar. Now, the battle between fraudsters and institutions trying to safeguard their users is a never-ending one. Whenever an institution shores up their efforts to protect its users, fraudsters will always attempt to find a chink in the armor and victimize unsuspecting users. As users increasingly go digital, so too do fraudsters. In a session that we did with Securities Commission Malaysia last week, the regulator also noted a spike in the number of bad actors. In fact, just recently when we did another webinar with OneSpan on user experience, security, one theme that consistently came out was how there are a lot of these fraudsters that are targeting the new digital users that are using digital services for the first time. And some of these people may or may not be so digitally savvy. So in light of this, we felt it'd be really important for us to do a webinar on this subject. And I'm glad to have a panel of experts joining us. Today we have Gabby Thomas, who is the Chief Risk Officer and the Group Head at Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, RCBC. Gabby is the second one on the screen. Above him, we have Chakan Lai. Chakan is the Vice President of Global Risk Advisory and Innovations at Visa. And below Gabby, we have Salim. Salim is the co-founder and CEO of BigPay Malaysia. And right below Salim, we have Sam Barkin, who is the Senior Product Manager for OneSpan in the USA. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to have all of you. Particularly thankful to Sam and Chakan that's tuning in late at night to share their thoughts with us, joining us all the way from the US. Now, why don't we begin by taking a broad look at things? And perhaps it'll be interesting for Chakan to start first, given Visa's global presence. Maybe you can give us a global sense of the fraud landscape right now. Chakan, you have the floor.
Sure. So I think basically, as everyone knows, there's a global pandemic happening. The thing with global pandemic like this is that things are going online at a much faster rate than it otherwise would have, right? We've seen the e-commerce channel accelerating tremendously over the last 12 months, well, probably 12 months plus. In fact, I just looked at some of the numbers not too long ago, and today, at least for Visa on a global basis, I think about 85% of our transaction volume is via the e-commerce channel, with only 15% in the face-to-face environment, right? So that actually highlights the fact that the world of commerce is changing rapidly. We believe that it would have gotten to this state regardless, but the pandemic has accelerated the entire movement from the face-to-face environment over to the card-not-present environment today. So obviously, fraudsters have also increased their attack in the CMP space as well, not surprisingly. And I think that that is happening across the world pretty consistently. Different things are happening at different parts of the world. Of course, with travel being locked down, but as everyone know, in a e-commerce channel, it doesn't really matter where you're located, be it US, Singapore, Australia. It is just literally a click away. So that's the global environment that we're facing and seeing today.
Thank you for that overview, Chakan. Why don't we jump on over to Gabby to give us a sense of the trends that's happening in the Philippines right now. Gabby, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Vincent. In terms of trending in the Philippines, actually, one of the things that the pandemic has brought about, and which is not very apparent to people, is the psychological effects it's had on people. Knowing that there's this risk, like a dark cloud hanging over your head, it creates psychological vulnerability in the mindset of people. People are less on guard. Actually, fear is something they have to live with day to day. And that is something that we're finding threat actors to capitalize on. The trend now is we're seeing a lot more social engineering-based types of attacks, mostly around instilling fear. In fact, they do play the card about, your account has been breached. you need to call this number, you need to give me these credentials so that we can, protect you from that. And that's the trend that we're beginning to see now. Aside from that, we've noticed that threat actors already have vectors which know how to intercept your SMS one-time PIN, and they're able to employ strategies to capture that and get that from you. And after that, they already have access to all your accounts. So these are two very important emerging trends we're finding that's happening right now. And I think institutions have to adjust their strategies, and a lot rests on also educating the users and helping them against to be aware at least of these types of attempts.
I think certainly user education is a key point that we definitely should zoom into a bit later as well. I think some of the trends that you mentioned are probably something that we see across the board. I'm sure when I jump over to Salim, he could probably also say the same observations that's happening as well. I think, Salim, one thing interesting that I also want to point out is that, now that we have these new digital financial services coming out, right, people are not just targeting banks to fleece users of money. With the growing popularity of platforms like BigPay and other e-wallets in other markets, it's the same thing. A lot of these fraudsters are like, let's try to target these platforms now, right? So maybe you can expand a little bit on how the trends of new digital services affecting how threat actors behave, and what are some of the trends that you see in Malaysia right now. Salim, you have the floor.
For sure. Thank you very much for that. So I think the most salient point that I heard from your introduction was that scammers are just like every other enterprise. They are going to go digital, just as every business has had to adapt and go digital. So have scammers. They are an enterprise at the very core, and they are organized. And I think that's something that are two key points that to take away from this. For all the guys that are in financial institutions and preventing fraud. It was very interesting. I think at the very beginning, of the pandemic, we saw small traces of scams taking place. We saw people starting, and then we started seeing, we saw the trend globally, like, on these kind of forums within the community, we could see that was really picking up. So immediately, I think there's two sides of it. The first thing is exactly as Gabby said, there is a psychological piece to this. Users are vulnerable, and there's two sides of it, right? The fear part that Gabby, outlined, but I think there is also the bit of having financial uncertainty, and the scammers really took advantage of that. They said, what we saw was that, we had a lot of our customers being called saying, hey, you've won something, you've got a chance to win. Just give us your IC number, your passport number, your blood sample, and your OTP, and you'll get all this money transferred to you directly. And it's in a time of uncertainty, something like this is, whether we like it or not, more believable, I think, to some people. So there was two sides. The first thing is, and as a financial institution, we have to attack it on two fronts. So yes, we have to make sure that our systems and our systems aren't compromised. We have, we're changing our risk rules to try and pick up and see what that consumer behavior looks like if they are convinced to do it. We have to educate users, and these are evolving initiatives internally. Like I think the organizations in Malaysia that were static really felt the pinch, because the scammers are just adapting. They just find your threshold and they adapt. So I think we got better over time at adapting our rules to prevent more and more of these scams. It wasn't like, March, I think 30th, we turned around and we had the perfect solution, because I think that it hadn't really stabilized in terms of scams. But, and you want to balance it out, right? So yes, could the scams happen without users giving away their information? No. Is it a responsibility of a financial institution to proactively look and see how we can mitigate that risk to our customers, even though they are giving their information? Absolutely, right? But at the same time, we need to also make sure that we still enable a good user experience, right? And your point on fintechs, I think that's a good segue to it, is that banks have always had that, and it's not good or bad, by the way, that, the mindset that let's make it super secure, we're not taking any risk on it, right? And I think fintechs have flourished, very much so, on the ability to say, okay, we get it, we're going to take a little bit of risk here and there, calculated, but we're going to take some risk and we're going to see how it goes. And I think that the COVID and the digitization of scammers was a good shock to a lot of fintechs because they moved very quickly towards, closer to where the banks are in terms of not security, but processes versus user experience, I would say, right? I think the security is kind of like an even bar. And I think we've seen those scammers around affecting banks in Malaysia, to fintechs globally, and even banks across the region globally as well. I think Singapore just DBS sent me an email saying that $300 million worth of consumer money has been stolen since COVID. So I'm assuming we're not the only ones.
That's a pretty staggering statistic. But as you pointed out, right, fraudsters are essentially an enterprise. One might wonder if they have a chief digital officer sitting down at a webinar discussing new trends on how they could target these things as well. But of course, like you said, I think in general, banks are a bit more risk averse, but I think there's a duality to it as well, right? I think Gabby would probably stand on the risk side, like, okay, we should try to protect the users. His colleagues from the innovation side, like, no, let's try something out funky or whatnot, right? So there's a lot of interesting things to talk about over there. But let's move on to Sam first. And Sam, we see that you guys publish a lot of research, a lot of white papers around this space. So tell us about some of the overview of the fraud landscape that you see right now in OneSpan.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, a number of the participants here have touched on a lot of the things for sure. So just want to kind of second what they're saying. But one other point is, and it's related to COVID and the pandemic and that sort of thing, and remote interactions over in person. But one thing that we're seeing is that, in general, sort of identity fraud, which, how you define that exactly might change here and there. But identity fraud and then application fraud related to attackers kind of attempting to get their hands on some of these stimulus funds and things like that. That's definitely something that was on the rise, as was mentioned, people being financially vulnerable, needing some assistance there. In the US, actually, there was a study recently that I saw saying that half of citizens were victims of identity fraud in 2020. I myself actually was nearly victim because someone tried to apply for unemployment benefits in my name. Luckily, my employer caught it. But in general, as a result of that, application fraud, where attackers are applying for accounts, are definitely up. Whether that's with stolen identities or synthetic identities, they're setting those accounts up, right, to kind of receive some of these funds. And so we're definitely seeing that in our discussions with a lot of banks that are looking to kind of solve for that increase in application fraud. And then in addition, just to kind of elaborate maybe a little on some of the other points that my friends here have brought up, we're also seeing increases in fraud related to the mobile channel specifically. Mobile malware is kind of on the increase. As Salen mentioned, attackers are in business and they want to get the best return on their investment that they can. They are seeing that, for one, more and more people are engaging more often in the mobile channel. They're seeing that more, like you said at the beginning, Vincent, people that are a little bit less savvy are engaging in the mobile channel. And so that starts to make it more and more worth their time to spend there and try to take advantage of any weaknesses there. And so, we'll get more into this, but that, mobile banking Trojans are going up. That's according to Kaspersky worldwide. But then there's also a sophistication there. Some of the social engineering items were mentioned where, there's malware that's capable of not only intercepting SMS codes, as Gabby was mentioning, but can automate sort of the initiation of a transaction, the theft of that SMS, and then automating the input of that so that it's sort of an automated kind of payment fraud situation going on because of mobile malware. So that those are just a couple more items to add to what's already been said.
Yeah, I think that provides us a very good overview of what are some emerging threats that we see in this space, right? So before I jump on to Chakan to talk about some other aspects as well, maybe while I still have you, after you've already kind of elaborated on the emerging threats, can you walk us through what are some of the things that you've seen organizations do, or how OneSpan has worked with some of the organizations to protect their users. And then I would direct the same question to Chakan and so on. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of what organizations can do, just to kind of talk a little bit more about these schemes where, you know, someone's account is taken over and then there's the automation of these transactions and that sort of thing. In one particular attack, a rather large one, right at the end of 2020, where the attackers were able to, they probably compromised the device in some way, shape, or form, got the credentials, and then they were also gathering data about the device itself. So, you know, a lot of fraud systems depend on device identifiers. You know, in one case, some of those identifiers are probably a little bit obvious, so that the attacker was able to, you know, again, gather that information and then kind of replay it, so that they were able to kind of bypass a fraud system that was probably not configured quite correctly. So there's definitely a need for a strengthening of some controls there. It becomes more and more important to kind of use a good number, a larger number maybe, of truly unique identifiers, or at least identifiers that an attacker can't easily determine. And you know, again, and one obvious thing there that really kind of tends to help is collecting behavioral data on the back end, building some profiles based on that. That's information that's not quite as accessible, obviously, to an attacker, so that they can't quite replay that. And then, you know, in addition to that as well, there's what's called behavioral biometrics. I think we're going to talk about biometrics a bit more later, but that's really you know, building a profile of someone based on how they're interacting with a mobile device. Now, that alone would not sort of suffice for strong authentication, but it's a good kind of continuous monitor to make sure that there's not automated actions happening on the phone, for example, right? It's not a bot that's interacting. It's an actual legitimate human, and to a certain degree, it's known that that's the legitimate user that owns the account. And then just in addition to that, and just the last one that we're really, you know, a lot of prospects are getting in touch with us about, customers, banks, financial services organizations, is, you know, again, based on the sort of security hygiene of users, you can't trust the devices upon which, you know, the mobile app actually executes. So there is advanced, you know, mobile app security technology that can actually travel with the app and allow the app to kind of execute even in, you know, potentially hostile, but at least untrusted environments, and kind of take action on some of these, you know, tampering sorts of behaviors that I'm talking about before, you know, kind of damage can be done, I suppose. So that's a few items. It's that back end data that you're gathering to build the profile, you know, behavioral biometrics on the client side as well, and then some more advanced, you know, mobile app security protection along with the app itself.
Thank you for that deep dive. Let's move on to Chakan. Chakan, where you stand right now and where you sit at Visa, walk us through what are some of the emerging threats that you're seeing, and what are some steps that Visa has taken to protect its users.
Okay, so I think Visa is in a slightly different, you know, our business is slightly different than a bank. Not sure how much the audience here realizes that we are not a direct B2C business. We don't go directly to the consumers, unlike a bank. We are actually a B2B to C company, right? So our clients are the financial institutions who sits behind consumers, cardholders, as well as merchants. So given that lens, what we do is basically we try to build secure technology. We build solution products that is inherently secure, because if you look at it, at the end of the day, it's going to be a very hard assumption for all consumers to be well versed in information security. Consumers are definitely not, well, remotely well versed in information security, if at all. So in order to mitigate against both the digital natives, you know, the population that were born into the world of digital computers versus digital immigrants, I think what we try to do is to promote, build, and implement secure technologies that are inherently secure that would reduce the amount of need for the end consumers to actually be that security experts. Right, I think that is one of the ways that we're trying to mitigate, generally over the last 5-10 years or so, mitigate the risks of a technology that the consumer use day in, day out, using their cards for the purchase of daily goods. On top of that, we have also built out capabilities within our network, because every single Visa transaction actually flows through our system, what we call VisaNet. And within VisaNet, we have built up a very sophisticated AI-based set of tools to actually monitor and risk evaluate every single transaction as they fly through our network. So to identify transactions that are riskier, right? So of course, that's not 100%, but that greatly helps. It helps our financial institutions in terms of identifying the high-risk transactions. A simple example there is that if a transaction happens, today, right now in the US, and 10 minutes later, another face-to-face transaction happens in Singapore, obviously one of the two transactions is going to be fraudulent, as an example, right? On top of that, given the fact that we have visibility into every single transaction, within the global risk team, we've also built up a very small surgical team. The name of the function is payment fraud disruption. So they run a 24/7 risk operation center, monitoring at the transactions for any signs of attack that may be happening on our network, and they have the ability to then either mitigate it by immediately declining implementing block, and therefore helping our financial institution mitigate some part of the fraudulent attacks on the ecosystem itself. A good example there is that enumeration attack, which is happening quite rampant today globally, where fraudsters using bots, writing bots to try to enumerate the 16-digit card number and expiration date. And there's a certain pattern that can be easily identified if you know what you're looking for. And that is what the payment fraud disruption team actually does day in, day out. And I believe a big part of their day-to-day today is dealing with enumeration attacks. So it's basically a two-pronged approach. Like I said, we're building secure products, and we have also solutions and people monitoring the network real-time 24/7 to help mitigate and resolve some of these attacks.
Thank you for that, Chakan, for providing us a kind of view into how Visa operates and whatnot. Just out of curiosity, before I move on to Gabby to talk a bit further about this. So if you compare 2019 to 2020, do you find that within Visa, you've noticed a spike in the number of red flags and things that the system capture as fraud compared to 2019?
I think the types of fraud or attacks have morphed a little bit. Let me give you an example. Right? Even before 2019, data compromise of a merchant was previously a pretty big event. There's a lot of news coverage. The biggest being, I'm sure everyone has seen, Target. Has always been, quoted in the press and whatnot. But if you fast forward to today, I think any compromise of a merchant seldom, if ever, even makes a blip in the media article, because it's no longer interesting, right? And another reason why as well is that the data that all these compromise incidents have been made less and less useful in terms of conducting attacks or committing fraud, because globally we have moved in a face-to-face environment from MagStripe to EMV, and we are in the process of deploying similar solutions in terms of tokenization in the e-commerce channel as well. So to answer your question, yes, definitely we have seen an increase. I guess, fraudsters as well as people who are out of job may be easier for them to find work as a in terms of moving over to the dark side. So we've definitely seen an increase as well.
Thanks, Jack. And I guess even the fraud space have a bit of a gig economy going on. Let's move on to Gabby.
Yeah, but I'm sure they also have the same challenges that we have, right? Which is being limited by resource. Just like it is pretty difficult for us to hire and to get someone who is well versed in on the positive on the good guy side of things. I think at the end of the day, I believe that they are also hitting up resource constraints, both in terms of finding humans to good enough to attack the system, as well as to monetize, because those are very different skill sets.
Thank you for that. And for the sake of the rest of society, I hope they don't succeed. Gabby, give us a sense of some of the emerging threats that you're seeing in the Philippines, and walk us through some of the work that you guys do in the risk team within RCBC to safeguard your users.
All right. In terms of the emerging threats, we see a rise in mobile payments, in mobile fraud, to be specific. In the fourth quarter of 2020, mobile fraud, in a study we saw, comprises about 44% of all fraud done, which is compared to 13% for the same period in the previous year. So just to walk you through the kind of defensive strategy we have as an institution for our clients, I totally agree with Sam. It's all about establishing behavioral data and patterns, and we do have that. We employ technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to monitor and establish baseline for our clients. But on the other hand of that, similar to what Chakan was talking about, we also have established process protocols. We have a team basically who has process protocols and acts quickly on any perceived threat or incursion. And that team is enabled across the enterprise. I believe in this type of strategy, response time is key. We may not prevent all incursions, but we try as much as possible to detect them immediately and act upon them immediately, thus minimizing further damage. Basically, it is a combination of technology and process, but the key there is rapid response time across the enterprise, in a sort of partnering with our users to make sure we have their backs, we're keeping them safe, and we're employing the latest technology to secure their transactions with us.
Thank you for that, Gabby. Now, before I move on to Salim, I just want to remind the audience that's tuning in live today, we are open to Q&A. So feel free to just type your question into the comment section of our YouTube channel, and we'll try to take the questions as much as we can. So let's move on to Salim. Salim, give us a sense of what are some of the emerging threats that you see in Big Pay, and give us an insight into what you're doing to protect the Big Pay users over there.
For sure. So going back to the earlier question as well, the threat has changed. We saw account takeovers, was really take the front and center stage, and then we saw, there are two primary use cases. One of them is to say, I need a conduit by which to move money out from perhaps primary bank accounts. And that's where a lot of the fintechs, I think, had where that was the use case of some of those scammers tapping into those account takeovers. And then they want to take the money away from the actual people that they'd taken over in terms of their accounts. So we proactively have taken we looked across our customers, and we looked at what were the key triggers that these scammers were doing. So I think it is important to us to delineate two things. The first thing is that when you have payment fraud, I think that's extremely important, right? So you're monitoring your transactions, and you're looking at what's actually happening. But by that point, it's a bit late. You can hold the money, don't get me wrong. You can protect the user's funds, which is the most important. But to a certain extent, when that money's already been taken, or the account's been compromised prior to the money being taken, you've almost already lost a bit of trust with your customer. So actually, those two things are both very important. So we, I think that our actual money, even when fintechs like us, for example, we saw a lot of ATO and the scammers, come onto our platform, or tried to come onto our platform rather. We stopped, all the money. Our customers haven't lost much money at all, right? So we tried to prevent that, and in all cases, it's been when they're giving away information. So that comes back to education, and I'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, we wanted to stop them even getting on the platform. So how do we look? We had our data science team like continuously working on our risk models and fine tuning them, making sure that we can pick up on any kind of clustering that we saw in terms of common data points. And actually, since then, we've been building our customer profiles exactly as what Sam mentioned as well, right? So, and it's taking. I think that's a really interesting point that you mentioned on device IDs, because initially, I won't go into exactly what we're doing now, obviously, just in case the scammers are being wise and tuning into this chat. But device IDs is exactly right. It's not robust. You need to have multiple data points, even for something so simple as this. So we've done a lot of that and a lot of hardening of our mobile application as well. So I think eventually, I think there are some very good steps that you can make. And one of we always say that we're happy to take the burden and the complexity in-house as an organization, but we want to be able to, the two things we don't want to compromise on is one, security, and the next thing is user experience. So in that order. So we won't compromise on security first and then user experience. So, but that often means that as an organization, you're deploying your tech teams, you're putting a lot of effort in your data science teams, you're in the background. You're buying, state-of-the-art software, you're ensuring that your product cycles always have a focus on this. The next big thing that we did as an organization was that we talked to the industry. We found that it's great if we have all these proactive developments on our product side and our tech side, our data science side, and our education side, but if it's not industry-wide and if it's not going out to the public broadly enough, it often doesn't have the same kind of impact. So we work together with our acquirers and on our partner banks to say, look, guys, this is the kind of scams we're seeing, and we were open in sharing that information with them, so that they could also proactively not only protect their customers, but put in place the right rules as well, and have the right education kind of narratives going out to their customers. And the last thing was education to our base. I think we've done a lot of blogs, we've done a lot of push notifications, and the whole point is to convince the user that if someone calls them and tells them they've won 10,000 ringgit, if they give away their information and their OTP, it's probably not true. 99.9999% not true. And so that's been, and I think now it's really good because we even see some of our customers posting on social media and trolling a lot of these scammers, being like, "Oh, this guy, I think he was going to convince me," which is a really positive sign. But I think it's a process, and I think customers are becoming more and more aware as the whole industry, pushes for awareness, and I think customers, as part of that, have become more accustomed and been. Whilst information security is not the forefront of their mind, it's definitely getting closer.
I think that's one of the few instances where internet trolls are appreciated for the work that they do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So actually, the next topic that I kind of wanted to move on to was to talk about the kind of technologies to look at. But I think one consistent theme that all the speakers have brought up about is the user education and how do we really get the users to be protected. So maybe that's the next thing that I want to kind of direct to the panelists. But before I do that, does anyone else have anything to add to the previous question before I move on? No. Okay, perfect. So maybe we can start with Sam. Sam, what are some of the things that you think the industry can do to further educate the users? Because as many of the panelists has pointed out, sometimes the weakest link is the consumers, right? So how do we get them to be alert? How do we get them to be vigilant to really reduce the instances of these things happening?
Yeah, and I think Salim, it's good to hear what they're kind of doing, right? Which is, hey, these scams are going on. Watch out for them. Also, just do not accept a call from anybody saying it's your bank. I just don't know if that's ever a good thing to do, especially with the scams that are going on right now. But I have a colleague, and he says this thing which I just love. And it'll be fun to hear other people's response to this. But he says that, of course, security is a partnership between the users and the bank, without a doubt. But at the same time, he says, the security of these applications, et cetera, is not the responsibility of the user, because in a similar fashion, you're not going to ask a user to underwrite the risk of their mortgage. You know what I mean? So, users, we all need to be educated. We need to be thinking about updating our mobile devices as often as possible, updating to the latest versions of the mobile apps, keeping our, personal information close to the chest. We all have responsibilities to do that. But banks are in a position to really be applying this advanced technology, as everybody has been talking about, to ensure that they're doing everything they can for users as well. So I've been in data security for a long time. And it really does feel like we're getting to a point where the general consumer is more informed and aware. But with that, I'll say, of what's going on right now, nothing is ever 100% secure. And, as we said, fraud and the like is a business. So if one opportunity is no longer sort of a lucrative target, there's going to be something else that the attackers are looking for there. So long story short, I think it's a matter of information and continuing to kind of make consumers aware of the sorts of scams that are going on and the things that they can do, which for the most part, at least in the mobile space, which I focus on myself, is keep your device up to date and keep your mobile apps up to date, and just do not click on mysterious too good to be true links that are sent to you through SMS and things of that nature.
Thank you, Sam. And Gabby, why don't you walk us through some of the things that you guys do in RCBC to educate your consumers to protect themselves?
Well, completely agree with Sam. Users have that partnership with their institutions. They're looking for advice. Basically, we're at the forefront, and we always let them know what the latest things to watch out for, reminders, if you will, what not to give, what never to give anyone, and what the banks will never ask you for over SMS or over a call. Aside from that, I also like to make a push towards letting users understand their devices in a more technical sense. The devices are becoming more valuable as a device for their transactions. So it would be in their best interest to find out what are the possible points of compromise on their side, like downloading apps from unreliable sites, accessing unreliable sites, unsecured Wi-Fi, SMS messages and emails, as well as having a sense of what information constitutes consummation of a financial transaction, so that they don't go out giving any of this information just very on a whim or anything like that. Knowing exactly what the critical information needed, so that when it's asked from them, they can think twice and say, "Oh, what's this guy asking for, and why is he asking for this?" Also, to Sam's point about if your bank calls you about something, be suspicious. And as a complement to that, I would advise people to establish a secure contact point to your institution. If it's a phone number of someone within the bank, or an access point that you've established at the beginning of the relationship, so that whenever you receive an email or a message saying your account has been compromised, call this number, you can verify on the means that you have established previously and say, I received this message, is this legitimate? And that's kind of like a personal multi-factor way of checking on any of these messages and messaging. We like to push this kind of consciousness with our clients. We always say it's a partnership between you and us. We do our best, but here is where you can also help yourself. That's basically the strategy in user education.
And I think those are all important points, right? And increasingly, I'm seeing more and more financial institutions pushing these messages on where they actually interact with the customers, whether it's on the mobile app, the online banking. Hey, we'll never ask for this, we'll never ask for that. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Now I would like to move on to Chakan to kind of give us a sense of how Visa works together with their partners to educate consumers. Maybe you can talk to us about some of this. I'm sorry, Chakan, you seem to be muted. You might want to unmute yourself.
Sorry
There
about
we
that.
go. Go ahead, Chakan.
Yeah.
It happens to all of us.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, so I think it's a shared responsibility, definitely, right? Because we work very closely with financial institutions. We work closely with the merchant community, as well as the processors. Effectively, what we are trying to push in terms of the message is that it's a shared responsibility, right? Ultimately, fraud is going to impact the consumer. If is going to impact the merchants, it's going to impact the financial institution as well. So in terms of messaging, again, indirectly, what we have been pushing over the last 10 years or so is PCI DSS. I'm sure everyone is probably pretty familiar with PCI DSS. And we have also, stood up programs educating the industry in general, how important it is to secure payment information. And we've also instituted programs and also basically a stick and carrot approach, and also instituted certain penalties if you as an entity got compromised. So yes, so we've definitely been educating from a data security protection perspective over the last 10 years or so. But looking forward, right? Looking forward, I think that we have maybe a new mantra and opportunity. I think the days of data protection probably is coming to the tail end in terms of what we could do to secure data. The mantra that I'm talking about is that maybe authentication of the consumer, specifically, authentication is the new encryption. Right? If you ever hear it, now you've heard it here first. Authentication is the new encryption, because ultimately, if you're able to authenticate the end consumer, if a financial institution is able to authenticate the cardholder, if a merchant is able to properly authenticate their clients, or the folks who shop at that particular merchant, that in and of itself could go a very long way in terms of mitigating the fraud and the various fraud attacks that we're seeing in the industry today. Unfortunately, this is also one of the biggest challenge, because even from the early days of the internet, we've all heard the cartoon that says that on the internet no one knows that you're a dog, right? And that's still true today, right? Over the last 20, 30 years of the internet, unfortunately, authentication has not been that big of a focus. That has slowly changed, right? With the FIDO Alliance, in the payment side, we have been pushing out 3D secure, Visa secure solutions over the last 10, 15 years. One could argue that is probably ahead of its time. But we've updated the protocol, making it seamless to consumers. So yes, so back to the question, there is definitely an opportunity to educate consumers. I think Sam has brought up a lot of the examples there in terms of educating, and also in terms of ensuring that our users, our consumers, cardholders are aware of the scams out there. But us collectively as an industry, we should also come together and develop and deploy, implement more secure authentication solutions, such that at the end of the day, when someone visits a website to purchase a trinket, or someone approaches a bank to apply for a new credit card, there is a very strong method by which that organizations could tell that this consumer is who the consumer is.
Thank you for that, Jack. And I think
Yeah.
a few very salient points you brought up over there, right? And I particularly like that line: authentication is the new encryption. The other thing to also kind of highlight, and I think when it comes to security, is unique in the sense that it's the only area where FIs and the industry don't compete with each other, right? Because at the end of the day, when one player is hit, then the reputation of the entire industry suffers. So that's definitely an area that I think all players should work very closely together on. Now, I'd like to take some questions from the audience now, but before I do that, does anyone else in the panel want to add anything to this conversation, or shall we move on to questions?
I just want. Oh,
sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Okay, just
Sam,
really
ahead,
quick. Like you said,
Sure.
love authentication is the new encryption. That's great. And when you brought that up, it just makes me think back to sort of ID verification and ID proofing, right? Where if you're bringing someone on, there's some talk that remote account opening can actually, if implemented correctly, can be more secure than a face-to-face sort of interaction that way. But anyway, if you're onboarding the customer, then you have their government ID, you're using a biometric to also authenticate them, and then you're building those credentials and binding them to the user in that process. It's like that authentication of the user could be considered just more secure than other things that have done before, because it's been pulled back to that government ID in the first place. So great point, I guess, is what I wanted to say, Chakan. That was great.
All right. Thank you for adding on to that, Sam. So moving on to the questions from the audience, I just wanted to kind of quickly remind the audience, if you're going to ask the questions, do try to direct it at a particular panelist so we know who you're directing the question at. So we have one question here, basically looking at what is the impact of fraud in terms of the company's reputation, the company's business. But the other dimension that I kind of wanted to add to that as well is, no matter what we do, no matter what steps we take to protect our users, there will be cases where, unfortunately, they will fall victim to this, right? So to add on to the question from the audience is, what steps can we take to kind of recover the trust from these users? So I'd like to open this to the panelists. Whoever would like to go first can unmute their mic, and then I'll bring that up on stage. Saleh, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, happy to kick that off. So I think the first thing with that, it's a really good question, actually, right? Because it's like, and it comes back to, what steps are you taking? Like, are you taking the right steps, and are you being quick, and are you being proactive? And that's not just, and I think, Gabby, you mentioned that earlier, right? It's like, it's not just about doing all the really, funky stuff on the back end where you're hardening your app, you're creating the right algorithms, you're consolidating your fraud rules, building user profiles. It is about communicating this to the customer to make them feel safe. This is where their money is, right? So it's not, it's not a social media app for financial services. So I think that to ensure that you don't lose the trust, that communication, and ensuring the customer is aware that you are, as an organization, aware of this and taking steps to protect them, is what I would say. And I think that for organizations that don't do that, I suspect it can be quite a big challenge. And that's whether you're a bank or a fintech or anyone actually in the space.
Thank you for that, Salim. Would anyone like to add to that question?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it's a lot of it is up to the user. You can't secure them 100% of the time. However, you can try to minimize the impact, because if, as an institution, a lot of your users are falling victim, even if it's not your fault, if it's something you didn't do, you've done everything you can, but still a lot of your users are falling victim, then guess what? That is still negative reputation impact on you as well. People will know that your particular institution has so many users who've been compromised over the last 3-4 months. And that is not your fault, that is their fault. But guess what? It hits you, it affects you. So that's right. We continue to partner with them. Not only do we have the technology and the process in the backbone, but we also reach out. This is a partnership, and the threat is evolving. So I would like to say this is a long-term relationship we need to cultivate, not only in terms of we're managing your funds and taking care of your assets, but we're teaching you how to secure our communication so that it's us you're talking to all the time and not someone who's trying to get those assets from you.
And I think at the end of the day, that's the viewpoint from the consumers, right? Whenever there's any breach, then the reputation that's hit is always the institution themselves. So I guess, you know, that kind of proactiveness is required to really be able to safeguard the users and kind of protect the reputation of the institution. I think Kaspersky did a study, right? They said probably about more than 50% of the users will walk away from the service if they find that there's been data breaches or any untoward incidents. And I think that number is probably higher if you're talking about financial services. So thank you for that insight. Would anyone else like to add to the question about how the impact of fraud and how companies can build back trust in the instance that it happens? Anyone else want to add on to this before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I might just say something really quick if you don't mind. I think
go ahead. No worries. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah.
So I think Gabby and Salim both touched on it, but think about this. It's important to think about that as part of the customer experience. And so if someone falls victim, hopefully you're being proactive, but just you want to have processes in place where it is easy for them to report that and work through the steps to, you know, minimize the damage as much as possible. But it should be considered as kind of part of the user experience as well. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Great.
Maybe one quick thing.
Yeah,
one quick thing to chime in here as well. I know that you asked the question about you know, the impact of trust or fraud to a company, specifically a company's reputation if it were to suffer a data breach or compromise, for example. But I think that there's also a role to play as an industry in terms of instilling trust in the consumers in transacting. So obviously Visa in the financial, in the card-based transaction world. So for example, I'll give a very quick example here, right? Under the US Reg E, consumers are only liable for $50 in terms of fraud, right? So under the regulations, and this is just the US, of course, there may be similar provisions elsewhere around the world. So that Reg E and the $50 max in terms of fraud liability, I think it helps consumer maintain trust in the overall ecosystem, even should something unfortunate like Target were to happen, right? Because the consumer is well assured that at the end of the day, under Reg E, I'm only liable for a maximum of $50 as well. So there's a flip side of that in terms of trust to the entire ecosystem versus just a simple single company. You need to maintain trust in the entire ecosystem as well. And regulations like Reg E goes a long way in establishing and maintaining the trust.
Thank you for that, Chakan. That segues nicely into the next question. But, you know, just to go back to the point of reputation and trust, one clear example of how that affects the reputation is the fact that Target probably happened in 2013, 2014. Nearly a decade later, we're still talking about it, right?
Exactly.
So clearly, reputation is something that takes a hit with this.
Yeah. Although the flip side, again, if you look at the share price of Target, I don't think you ever, short of that blip when they actually got compromised, it didn't impact them at all.
For sure. Thanks for adding on to that. So this segues nicely into the question from one of our audience, right? The gist of the question is basically looking at whether or not policies and regulations in this space is sufficient, right? So and that was nicely brought up by Chakan as well about Reg E and how you know, only $50 is something that the users are liable for. So I again open this question to the floor. So whoever would like to go first, just unmute the mic and I'll bring you up on stage. Everyone's being a gentleman right now. Would anyone like to comment on the state of regulations and policies, if it's sufficient?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Happy to give it a stab. So I think we've seen.
Go ahead, Salim.
Okay. Sorry to realize there was a maturity of like the regulations coming into this space, right? Like you've seen TRM in Singapore, you've seen RMIT in Malaysia, and I think these are fantastic developments, right? That actually take what was once probably embedded into the regulation, the specific regulations itself, and broadening it across. Sign of maturity, the threat vectors are actually across the board, and they are blurred across the different types of institutions. So I think to be fair, I think the regulators are very aware and have been for some time, and that's why we've seen the the kind of deployment of a lot of these policies coming out, and organizations, quite frankly, have to take them seriously and have to adhere to them. And I think that one of the key elements that's quite interesting in the regulations as well is a risk-based approach, which sometimes you see with some regulators, perhaps in different countries, haven't done it. But I think that Malaysia with RMIT and TRM in Singapore, they have, which is extremely important as well for organizations.
Thank you for the input. Who would like to go next to talk about the state of regulation in this space? If not, then we can Chakan, yes.
Yeah, just something to add. So regulation, unfortunately, fraud in this space has no borders. So while regulation is very well defined in terms of its jurisdiction, right? So I know that we have instances where, and everyone here on the call probably is well aware of as well, that any types of a scam or any type of a attack, cybersecurity attack, cuts across multiple nations. So in order to bring down any one of these fraud rings, generally a Visa will have to involve Interpol because of the nature of jurisdiction. And I think fraudsters and bad actors are actually taking advantage of that. Where jurisdiction regulations have boundaries, the work that they do for the bad actors doesn't have one. So I think that is unfortunately the challenge that all of us in the industry are being faced with today as well.
I guess that goes to say that more of the regulators need to sit down together and sync up on the regulations and try to catch up with these things, right? So thank you for adding that point. So before we move on, Gabby, Sam, anything else to add to this conversation?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gabby.
A few points, a few insights on the state of regulations. I believe I believe Chakan is right. This has to be a solution that will cut across borders. So the first step there is for governments to set up specialist units, agencies, if you will. These agencies will be at the leading edge of the technology. It's an evolving threat, so they have to evolve their skills as well. But at the same time, there has to be multilateral coordination with other nationals and countries. Similar to what goes on when you extradite someone, so that you can put teeth into enforcement as well. So I've had very meaningful conversations with local government here in the Philippines, and they are working on the technology piece as well as the agency piece, and that's something we are really looking forward to. And we understand that it's an evolving threat, but we take heart in the fact that government is aware and is also evolving the response for this threat.
Very cool. Thank you for that. Sam, anything else to add before we move on to closing thoughts? Okay. All right, cool. So we've unfortunately ran low on time. We just got a couple more minutes to go. I apologize for those whose questions we are unable to take, but now we have to move on to just wrapping up the session. So maybe we can have Salim, Chakan, Gabby, then Sam share with us some parting advice, some closing thoughts, and some technology areas that they think institutions can focus on in their efforts to win the war against fraud. Salim, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So thank you very much. I think firstly it's really important to have these conversations. I think that across borders as well. I think that it's to the last point, it's even easy for regulators aside and law enforcement aside. It's easy for institutions within a market to collaborate, and it often becomes harder for institutions cross borders to collaborate. And that and when they do, it just makes it a lot more simpler because the scammers itself is cross borders. That's the first thing I would say. The next thing is being proactive. I think one of the best things that we did, that helped us be proactive and change our tech quite early on in this process, was I think a lot of companies have bolted on a lot of different pieces of fraud time. No one size fits all, but often there needs to be a way to bring all of that together And that is the only way, or one of the only ways that you can actually build your user profiles, authenticate properly, understand your customer, of enough of a level to be able to be proactive in a meaningful way and compromise user experience the least. And I think that, it is a big task, and it's definitely easier for more nimble and younger organizations. But if you do it, and people and financial institutions invest in it, it can, reap a lot of rewards in the long run.
Thank you for that, Salim. Chakan, your closing thoughts and some technology areas you think institutions should focus on.
Sure. I think that given the title of the webinar, how to win the war against fraud, and as everyone knows, whenever you have a war, there's also opportunities as well, opportunities to profit in terms of solutions, right? And so I think the thought that I have is that, from a technology perspective, we should continue to build products that are secure by design, right? We should not build solutions and technology and implementations that has big gaping holes. So by building secure products that are secure by design, we reduce the need for other entities, especially consumers, because at the end of the day, I said that earlier before as well, they're definitely not information security experts. So products that are secure by design will go a long way in mitigating the fraud that is coming up today, as well as down into the future. And the other one, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, authentication. Authentication is the new encryption.
All right, thank you for that. Let's move on to Gabby. Gabby, what are your closing thoughts and technology areas that you think institutions should focus on?
Well, I believe institutions should continue to focus on technology, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, as well as the process protocols to enable rapid response and close coordination with their users. More than that, I'd like to leave the audience with this particular message. As a user, there are a few practical things you can do to really help yourself avoid all of these threats. As I mentioned, know where your devices are vulnerable. Unsecure apps, unsecure sites, unsecure Wi-Fi access points. Number two, know what data points are required to complete a financial transaction so that you can secure these accordingly and know that when someone is asking for this data, then you should be suspicious. And, as I also mentioned, number three is establish a secure contact point with your institution. Know who to call when you're suspicious about something so that you can verify. Aside from that, there's also a few very simple things you can do, probably on a daily basis. Check your balances. Just see if there are any transactions there that you don't recognize. You don't know it, you may not know it, but you've been compromised. Aside from that, also make sure that you also have safeguards on your personal data, your device, know where it always is. A little bit of these things you do on a daily basis can go a long way. As we mentioned, the institutions will do what they can, invest in all this technology, but at the end of the day, the threat actors will go at the weakest link, and most of the time that is the user. So we also invest in strengthening the user and strengthening the information the user is equipped with.
Thanks for that, Gabby. Now, Salim has to leave. He has a hard stop, but I'd like to thank him for joining us and sharing his insights with us. But let's move on to Sam to provide the closing thoughts and technology areas that we can focus on as an industry. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, great. Just to add on a little bit to what it's already been some great closing thoughts here. As I think we've kind of gotten to, if we haven't explicitly stated it, is that one, authentication is more and more important. I'm going to reiterate Chakan's phrase there. Authentication is the new encryption. Authentication is very closely tied to identity proofing, and at the same time, fraud, monitoring, management, mitigation. All three of those areas are really coming together. So tying those things together, and as I said, gathering non-obvious sort of identity information about in a mobile context, but this is also obviously possible, with laptops and personal computers as well. But really building up a lot of information about the device itself to authenticate the device itself, right? That's what I'm talking about, along with the user, and then being sure, as has been said, that there is machine learning going on behind the scenes to be kind of detecting any aberrations that just can't be detected, at the speed of human. But all of those things are coming together. They all really fundamentally affect the user experience. And so you want to stay out of the customer's way as much as possible, but be doing as much as you can to be authenticating those users and kind of monitoring those sessions on a continuous basis. So those are sort of my parting thoughts here.
Thank you for that, Sam. And on that note, it's the perfect time to end our session. And I'd just like to thank the nearly 150 of you who's tuning in live today, and the panelists for taking time to join us, particularly Sam and Chakan, who's also tuning in quite late. Thanks again, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this session. And thank you. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We post content like this at least 2 or 3 times a month. Hope to see you guys soon again. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.